Hi, my name is Chase Ferguson, and I'm a graduate history student at Liberty University. Today, we're making a recording, and we're going to discuss the Great Awakening and its impact on Christianity in early America, specifically during the Revolutionary period. The Great Awakening uh, was never known as the Great Awakening until later in the 20th century, but in essence, it was an evangelical shift that occurred in preaching and Protestant Christian religion and those practices in America. The movement kind of went through Europe and most of English America around about the 1730s and 1740s. About 2 decades worth of some major preaching that occurred and a dynamic shift in the way that the church handled itself and the type of preaching that people would receive. Um, Basically, there was a very powerful style of preaching that would occur. Very strong orators that were resolute and definitive in the way that they spoke. Uh, they were really focused on the salvation experience and the acceptance of Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And it really kind of changed away from the more pomp and circumstance style of stuff of saying, specific creeds and things like that maybe perhaps the Catholic Church had really popularized and made the standard in previous decades and centuries to perhaps more of a modern revival style sermon that we might see today in a Baptist or a Pentecostal church. So basically, Christianity really became more of a spiritual experience than just something that you do as a tradition or a set style, right? So the good thing about this was, though, that it did increase the desired level of morality amongst individuals, and it really espoused personal responsibility when it came to your morality and your religious principles in the way that you lived your life and conducted yourselves. Uh, it really became a major event in New England where people in the region were from multiple different denominations of church. You have all sorts of variations of Protestants there, along with the Anglican Church specifically. And there's kind of created like a split in between the more traditional people and this new revivalist style. Basically, uh, there were some people who really held tight. They clung to the ritual style of worship, and then other people really enjoyed these more upbeat and sometimes very gloom and doom type of messages of hell and brimstone. And it was really sort of an interesting pluralism that was occurring within colonial America just prior to the revolution and somewhat leading up to it. And I think that it certainly had an impact on changing the minds of colonists prior to the revolution, and probably helped persuade many of them to make the decision that independence from England would be a good thing. Obviously, there's multiple reasons between the Stamp Act, taxing any sort of paper good, the Tea Act leading up to the multiple tea parties all up and down the eastern seaboard. We know about all these things, but worship and having some sort of a government-run church was also an issue, I think, for colonial Americans during the 1730s and 40s, leading up to the 60s before the Revolution really took a strong hold, ultimately leading to America's war for independence. Needless to say, African slaves are also another group of people who were greatly impacted by the Great Awakening. And I think it's important to take a look at them because we'll eventually be able to see what changed in their lives and how are they still impacted to this day and what we see in modern African American churches that can be reflected from the Great Awakening. Really and truly, there were three prominent people that really pushed the Great Awakening's message. One of them being Jonathan Edwards from Massachusetts. Edwards was a Calvinist. Uh, he really was all about the religious spiritual experience, the true understanding and personal knowledge of Jesus Christ as your Savior, and knowing that you needed him no matter what. He had very powerful sermons, a wonderful orator, and a large following of people would gather around and listen to him preach for long durations of time in big open air areas and things like that. So Jonathan Edwards was a major contributor. Another serious force in the movement would have been George Whitefield. George Whitefield was probably one of the best revival preachers of the last several centuries. He traveled all up and down the colonies after he came from Europe in 1739 and 1740. And Benjamin Franklin actually was not necessarily like a devout, follower or something like that, but he really admired the guy. He liked the way that he provided his sermons and the format that he did, and even gave like a synopsis of exactly how many people that George could speak to at one time in open air. And it was incredible how his voice carried so far. And he wagered how many people he believed that he could actually preach to at one time in a given location. His sermons were very emotional, and Benjamin Franklin used this to his advantage and printed, I believe, about 45 of his sermons with his own printing press and publishing company, which helped George Whitefield's message get out to more people and things like that. So Franklin definitely helped push the Great Awakening. And with Franklin being at the center of this, I think that kind of shows us how America's founding fathers were certainly interested in religious morality when it came to arguing for independence and the right of man to be independent from government. Small government being better. So the less that government must interfere with someone, the better, because if you have a moral and just people, like what the Great Awakening was espousing, then you need only limited government to control a population like that, because for the most part, they're self-sustaining and self-controlling. Samuel Davies is another major evangelist that came up during this time. He was a Presbyterian minister and would later also become a university president at Princeton. And he was very much focused on helping slaves come to know God and have a personal relationship with him. He really and truly tried to help slaves. He wanted to see them become better educated, have a better experience, and be treated as if they were at least equals when it came to their experience and salvation with the Lord. He wanted them to be able to read and write so that they could study and become more acquainted with biblical teachings. And he believed that would definitely help them in the long run, and that they could be just as educated as a white person. Needless to say, in Noel's book here, most of this is covered, the history of Christianity in the United States and Canada. I think it's a good read. Most of this will be covered here. You'll see all sorts of information about the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, and the types of sermons that were preached and the pamphlets that were handed out and the large crowds and numbers. And I think the important thing to remember here is that so many people would have been impacted by this, that it definitely shaped and changed the way that people looked at not only religion and faith-based things in colonial America, but also the way that they looked at government. And the way that they sort of embraced the Enlightenment concepts through religious concepts as well. Having said that, that pretty much wraps up our presentation. This has been Chase Ferguson discussing the Great Awakening in colonial America. Thank you and have a great night.